Welcome to Read, the research, education, and advocacy podcast, where we connect you with prominent leaders, researchers, and educators who share their insights and work about education and child development. This, as you can see on the screen and as you're tuning in, this is the second Lead on Read episode with Dr. Lakeisha Johnson and my co-host, Jamie Williamson. I don't even know who to say hello to first. Jamie, since you're my co-host, welcome to Lead on Read. So nice to have you here.
Great to be here. So excited to do this again.
And Dr. Lakeisha Johnson, my newest best friend from FCRR. Hello, welcome back.
Hello, internet friends.
Yes, at some point we'll meet in person.
I love how many friends we have at the Florida Reading Research Center. I think there's such a great pool of talent down there, and I really appreciate you taking some time to chat with us today. So yeah, super.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me and inviting me back for a second time.
Yeah,
of course.
There was just too much to talk about, I think, for Danielle, so we had to have you back.
Yeah, let's just start, I guess, since there's all three of us, where we're at today. So, Lakeisha, how are you today? How are you approaching this conversation?
I am good today. It's been a busy week here in Florida, as probably everyone is aware, but things are well. We are looking forward to all of the projects and activities that we have going on around the center. So things are really well.
Great. And Jamie, how are you approaching this conversation? I know probably just as busy.
Yeah, no, it's been a busy week. You know, New York is experiencing what's probably been the mildest winter we've had on record. So I have a lot of conflicted feelings about that. I'm really glad I didn't have to make a snow call just yet, but I'm also really sad that we've not had a snow day. So this is not typical. So I'm, it feels like spring out here, but yeah, no, super excited to take a pause in my busy week to sit down and have a really fun conversation. So that's
definitely. Are snow days really a thing anymore? Because now that we've had virtual learning, do we really still get snow days there?
Wonderful question. So I'm a big proponent of actually maintaining it because I think there's some nostalgia there. And we have some working families who that's not having, the ability to kind of manage some of these pieces and sort of coordinate an at-home impromptu at-home remote day. So we're trying to kind of keep a couple in our calendar, but just this year we weren't able to do that. So yeah.
Absolutely. Definitely the nostalgia, but also just all the experiences and things you can do at home on those kind of days. So all things are important.
I would agree.
Yeah. Well, speaking of New York, I mean, we all know that New York has been busy too with dyslexia research and reading research. And in the last episode, Lakeisha, you and I spoke about this integrated approach to addressing reading difficulties and reading failure through a systems approach. We talked about ecological systems framework, and reminder to all of our readers, Lakeisha, you had co-authored the paper with Nicole Patenteri and others from FCRR, building a framework to understand and address vulnerability to reading difficulties among children in schools in the United States. We have that article linked on the readpodcast.org. If they Googled your name, Lakeisha, it would definitely come up. We also talked, oh my gosh, you know what? We talked about a lot. Oh my gosh. Yeah, we talked about the village. We talked about Maya's book nook. And what struck me about your work is it intersects so many facets of a child's life. And you also intersected a lot of facets of leadership. And so as soon as we got off, I think I called Jamie 6 times and I was like, no matter what you're doing, all your important meetings, I need to talk to you about Lakeisha. And he was like, we have to do it.
True.
And yeah, so true. And so I think before we get into the conversation, I'll let Jamie start to ask you about some leadership questions. But for our readers that haven't tuned into episode 41, I thought we would introduce you first, just to, and actually, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we jump into the conversation?
Sure. I mean, it's very, it's funny though, because I don't often see myself as the leader. I kind of made a joke oh no, you should be talking to Nicole Patenteri, not me, right? But in my own way, I am an assistant faculty at the Florida State University in the School of Communication Science and Disorders. My research focuses on African-American children and language and literacy development, executive functioning, all the things that impact how kids learn how to read and how it impacts academic outcomes. I'm also the director of the Village, as you mentioned, which is one of FCRR's newest divisions, which focuses on community engagement and outreach. And so and like you also said, you kind of gave the rundown already. I also run a website, Maya's Book Nuts, that focuses on promoting strong language and literacy foundations through diverse children's books. And so it's been really nice being in a position such as this, where I'm able to have that intersectionality, where a lot of the things that I am passionate about really get to come into play and intersect at work, at home, and everywhere. So both in my professional and personal life. So it's been really fun.
Thank you for sharing that. And I know, Jamie, you had some questions for Lakeisha on leadership. And I love, Lakeisha, you said, I don't consider myself, you should be interviewing Nicole, and all this work is truly the intersection of leadership. And so, Jamie, do you want to ask Lakeisha a little bit more about that?
So, yeah. And as you know, I love talking about leadership, and I also love understanding people's stories in the process.
Mm-hmm.
I have a dear colleague who's always kind of pushed me to reminded me that, I have a story on my heart about how I kind of came into the work, and everybody else has a great story in that process. And I want to make sure that we have a chance for you today to kind of talk a bit about that journey. Because I do think when you come into leadership, sometimes there is people have to wait for kind of permission to lead, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things in my work I've always tried to do is not have anybody have to wait. I give that permission freely. I want to share that space with people. I want to empower those around me to kind of own and lead from their space. But also too, like, you come to the work in a very unique way. I do believe there's a little calling here, right? So I'm a psychologist by training. I worked in public schools. I used to evaluate children. And had you told me when I was my 12-year-old self that I was going to be leading a school program in New York one day, I would have rolled off a chair laughing at you. Right. Didn't like school very much. I'm from Eastern Kentucky originally, even in the podcast where you talked about, Appalachian dialect and all this, I'm actually, I'm a code switcher. I grew up in a space where I did not speak in the way that I get to talk on a daily basis now. And when I go home for a weekend or a couple of days, I come back, my accent is thick. The things that I say, I've got to pay a lot of attention to. And so I can really identify with some of that work. But coming into this work in education for me has been, a big byproduct of seeing and feeling my experience in education and not wanting any child to feel that way. Right. Not wanting to put a child in a space where they don't have the resources to do, not having the things that they need. And I love when I get to hear a little bit more about other people's stories. So, you talked a little about your journey, and I loved when you talked and reflected on your work in undergraduate and seeing this clinic run and how that sort of changed your entire perspective.
It did.
So I'm gonna let you pick up from wherever in that story you need to pick up, but talk about what kind of called you to this work.
I think it was really that experience in undergrad. I mean, I have been a person who I guess you could consider a natural born leader, kind of even through matriculating through K through 12. I was always the one who was volunteering to be the president of the club or the vice president, always kind of wanting to make a difference in that way, to be able to rally everyone together, even in a lot of my friend groups and circles. And one I'm called the link, because it's like that person who makes sure we all keep it together, no matter how far the distance now is between us. So I kind of always had that personality. But when it comes to that undergraduate experience, I thought I was going to be a journalist. That was what I knew I wanted to do. And when that wasn't available to me, I had to figure out another path. And it just so happened that I met a professor, Dr. Regina Lemon, who showed me the beauty in speech language pathology and communication science and disorders, a field that I really didn't have a lot of knowledge of. And as I began to learn more and more about the field, and when I went through my master's and PhD program here at Florida State, I just really started to see a lot of the inequities that were present within our educational system, specifically with children of color. Even more specifically as a person who's grown up in rural South Carolina, right? So I'm from a very, very small town called Lynchburg. Nobody's gonna know where that is unless you have been through central South Carolina, right? Not too far, right in between kind of Columbia and Myrtle Beach, right? So those are kind of your markers for it. But most people would have never heard of this really, really small town. And it was the kind of place, my upbringing was, you didn't, the way that I was raised, you didn't know what you didn't have. right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We never thought that we were growing up in this kind of lower class, kind of poor family, because we were surrounded by so much love and education and knowledge, to where it really felt like when I got into experiences in my graduate degree, when I saw the differences, in terms of how kids were performing, it really made me become more interested and invested around vocabulary, around literacy, around dialect, language. Why are all these things, why is it all so different, right? You could have two kids, same parents, same household, growing up and have a completely different kind of linguistic system. Like you said, Jamie, the code switching that we do, you will hear it here. I'm also in this season of life to where it comes out, and I'm okay with that. I try to show up as fully as my authentic self as possible in all of these spaces, because I think it's important. And if I go home, it will surely, it surely shows up if I go home for a week or two. But I think it's important. And when I was in my graduate program, I was doing my dissertation around vocabulary, and that was my master's, was around vocabulary. But my dissertation was really focused in on dialect. And really, I had this question: why do some kids do this thing like we're talking about, code shifting, dialect switching, and some don't, right? Like my grandmother, my mom, nobody ever told me to do it, right? No, it was never something that somebody said, Keisha, when you talk to this person, you need to change the way you talk, right? But I saw that model. Mm-hmm. I saw that it was different at church than what it was when we were at home, different at school versus my grandmother was a teacher. She was an educator. It was different at school than it was at this place. And you started to see some of those things. I was always really intrigued by what were kind of these underlying characteristics and skills. And then, of course, I was doing work with a lot of the amazing people that you mentioned at the Florida Center for Reading Research, which has just been so impactful because of the interdisciplinary nature. Being able to be around people who have different backgrounds and lenses for how we approach literacy has been so very eye-opening, because as a speech language pathologist, pathology is in the name of our field. Very often we're thinking about things through this lens of fixing something, right? Mm-hmm. And being involved in a lot of this interdisciplinary work, and also thinking about our more equitable approaches to even how we serve children. We can't have this approach that we need to treat before we even teach something, right? Like we're constantly thinking about how to treat it, but it's like, how do you know that this is even a skill set that's been taught? Who says it's one that needs to be taught, right? Like all of these variables that play a role. So in terms of where I currently am, I was given the opportunity to lead by my mentor, Dr. Nicole Patton-Terry. We have been a duo now for almost 10 years.
Power duo.
We first worked together at Georgia State University in Atlanta at the Urban Child Study Center, which she founded with Dr. Gary Bingham. And she was doing a lot of work with Dr. Bingham, Dr. Julie Washington, who I did my postdoc with. And within that experience, I did both my postdoc and worked as a research scientist there. I had no clue. I did not want a tier 1 or a research 1 faculty position. I wasn't trying to be on anybody's tenure track. I saw Dr. Terry and Dr. Washington, and I didn't want that for my life. I was like, nope, I don't want the pressure. I don't want the hustle. I really enjoyed that space of research science where I could just do the projects, do the work, teach a class or two on the side, still have an impact on students. But you know how it goes. I think when your mentors see something in you, they give you more opportunities, right? So very often they see more in you than you even allow yourself to recognize. And so when we both left Georgia State at the same time, Nicole came here to FSU. I went to the University of the District of Columbia in DC, where I worked for 2 years. And that was my first position, first tenure track position. And it just so happened my husband got recruited to come to FSU. It was nothing that was me. Yeah. He got recruited to come back. And he came and she said, we got to get back together. We're going to do this. And so that's how the village was born, that this coming back and being called to lead, I think, has been one of it's such a humbling experience when, you see that people see those characteristics in you. But it's been an amazing opportunity to allow others to play a role in our shared vision for the village and the work that we want to accomplish in our local community.
Outstanding.
So it was a long way to say I was kind of voluntold.
So,
but also it was definitely one of those experiences where it was just all of these things that kind of came into place that allowed me to be in this position.
So Danielle's going to have to work to keep me on track because there are so many things in what you just said that get me really excited. When I think about, and I want to kind of come back to one of the things you talked about earlier, this idea of seeing the need. Mm-hmm. And so in your work, and I think in leadership, often leadership is this sort of intersection between passion, people, and purpose, right? There's a why here, understanding one's passion. And sometimes I think people think about passion from this sort of like inward birth of like, I see this thing I need to go do in the world. And I don't know that that's actually where it always comes from. I think it comes from seeing the need outside in the world and this desire to fill that need, right? That's the internal part for me. So when I hear you talk about seeing the need out in the community and the desire to kind of push into that, I get beyond excited. And then this notion of connecting to people and making sure you're doing this work and sort of validating, even bringing your whole self to the conversation. Because I do think it's such an important part for us and showing up as our like truly authentic self in that moment. And then when I hear you're talking about this notion of purpose and the work and moving that forward, again, I just like, we could have a whole hour and a half conversation about those three things alone.
I like your 3 P's.
Me too. I'm writing that down.
Yeah.
Yes. Passion, purpose, and people. That could be like a whole thing, a whole infographic. I love it.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I reflected on deeply with your sort of your upbringing, your experience, because I came from Eastern Kentucky in a really poor, super remote space. Like sometimes I joke with friends that like if we went home without getting gas in the car, like it was 45 minutes to get back, right? Like you had a drive to get to a gas station. But like there was such a level of love, such a sense of community. And when I went to college, I remember like I went to college thinking, I'm from a middle class background, and I get to college and I was like, oh, wait a minute,
hold up.
I'm not like, that's not, my parents worked so hard. We had a great family and a great house, but like it was on land my family had lived on for, a long time, like probably 100 years. And so, we had everything we needed. We wanted for nothing, but I think there was some pride in the sense of what we had and what we, without sort of having the comparison of what we didn't have.
Right.
Which I think is one of the beautiful things that's been lost in Appalachia in general. It's like now there's all this comparison of like, which I think is often to the detriment of others in the process of that. But I just so appreciate you sharing that about your story. And when if you could think about sort of a word or a phrase right now from a leadership perspective that's really kind of speaking, resonating with you, what would that word or phrase be?
That's a hard one. I think showing up. Showing up. It is so important for me as a leader to be visible. Yeah. To be responsive, right? And especially to, as you've mentioned, to see the need, right? And to be responsive to that need. And no job being too big, too small, right? Yeah. But then also showing up for my team. We've put together a really, really amazing team of people that have very varied backgrounds, and showing up for them while also empowering them to figure out what they want, right? What are their paths? What are their strengths? How can we highlight them? Ensuring that they're getting the tools they need to be successful in all the things, right? So I think showing up is something that's so important, and meeting whatever the present kind of a need or priority is. And right now there are lots of them. Yeah. And so I think I would say show up.
I love that. So again, I feel like we could have an hour conversation on that topic alone. Because I do think in leadership, like there is, often we focus on the power in leadership, right? I can do and I can say and I can decide. But I think the other thing that we forget to talk about enough is this idea of responsibility. When you have leadership, when you're in a leadership position, it's not just, yes, I get the power to decide and I accept that sometimes we have to make decisions.
Right.
But it also comes with this incredible responsibility. And I would argue that this idea of showing up is one of the most important responsibilities we have.
Absolutely.
We got to show up for our people. We got to show up for each other. We got to show up for our mission. We got to show up for our values. So I just, you're filling my heart right now. So thank you for that.
Yes, definitely.
I want to jump in with that too, because when you talk about showing up, first of all, I love this because the shared story, like I would just sit back and just like, the shared story is just so dynamic. And I love learning from both of you and going back and forth. And when you talk about showing up, Lakeisha, I want to dig a little deeper into the process of showing up every day, because when you talk about showing up, it's an everyday process. And from just today to as big as projects of showing up and how you created the village. And what I'm getting to that is the village, when you launched it with Nicole back in 2019, it was this project, this launching as a result of the two of you showing up every day to address the need. And so when Jamie and I were talking about the village, we thought to ourselves, well, how did they get there? Like, how did you just start? Like, the village, obviously, when people see it, and it's now out in the world, it's the consequence of so many things coming together. And so what we're curious about is where did the vision for the village come from? And can you walk us into that process of how you were creating it from the ground up to tinkering to where it is today?
Right. Well, I'll first say that the village and its goal, this wasn't a new thing for us, right? So while the division and the name and all are new for FCRR, this was not necessarily anything different from the work that we had previously been doing, right? So at Georgia State, the Urban Child Study Center, the village is definitely a model that we wanted to duplicate that we saw there. How do you take something where you are really meeting the needs of the local community, so a place-based approach, right? Really getting in, meeting the people, being there for the community stakeholders, identifying their needs, and then deciding how we can take this information that we have, these best practices, these, all of the skill set that you have of all of these people on the university side. How do you get that to the people who need it the most? And how do you change the messaging? Because the messaging is completely different, right? How do you gain the trust? And for both of us, it was probably in 2018 when my husband was being recruited, we literally sat in a conference room and we spent the entire day together and literally mapped out the core values and the vision and mission that you currently see on our website. And we knew that the first part had to be that we have a responsibility to our community. Most specifically, we are invested in terms of ensuring African-American kids who are growing up in poverty, kids who have disabilities. We both come from backgrounds as special educators, right? SLP, she was a special education teacher, right? We both come from these backgrounds that focus on vulnerable population. So it was, and if you think about where we're located, I think I mentioned this in our last episode, but the poorest zip code in Florida is located right where we are, right? So while our kids may go to a really great school, that is not the same for every school I have to pass to get to the FCRR office, right? And so while there have been really, really amazing strides that have taken place, when we got here in 2019, there were, I'll be honest and say that as you see in probably any research town or college town where there's a big research university, there are research harms that take place, right? You have to work to build relationships. And so when we got in that conference room, we literally mapped out, what do we want to see? And the thing that kept resonating with both of us, and the old African proverb, it takes a village. That's where our name comes from. It is literally more than just us. It can't just be us. We are an N of two, So we have to also sell people on this idea that it takes the entirety of our team, right, to be able to do this work and to make that shift, which is a culture shift, right, among many and for many people. So we really wanted to sit and kind of think about what were the things we wanted to accomplish the most. And the first one was always, we have a responsibility to the communities that we live in. These are the communities that our kids are being raised in. And we want to act accordingly, right? We want to support the things that are happening in our community. We also believe in just this whole thing of it's a full community effort, right? In order to ensure academic success.
Right.
And we know that this is not something that stops at K-12, right? Like what happens in these years, what happens before school entry, all of these things set a child up for the trajectory for the rest of their lives. And so we're not just focused on just the kids in the classroom, it's also families, the school as a whole, the community as a whole. So those are some of the things that we wanted to kind of center. And of course, always remembering we're researchers, right?
Right.
So you have to also do the research, but do the research in a way that answers the questions that the community partners have and it meets their needs. And so while we value all types of research, right? We value all of the things. Me personally, I am most interested in the projects that are going to help this kid, this school year, this teacher, this family right now, right? So I can do a lot of amazing things that will inform theory. And we are very fortunate to be in a center to have people doing that amazing work, right? That is, that those massive RCTs and all the things that I don't necessarily do in my work, right?
Yeah.
Our work is quite different, but I think they all serve their purpose, and we have to have people who have those kind of differing values, and not necessarily differing values, but differing approaches to get us to the same end, because our values are still the same, but we have different approaches. And I'm very much focused on ensuring that everything I do has this immediate impact. So how can we see that this has actually made a difference?
Yeah. I wish I was in that boardroom with the two of you. I'm like, oh my gosh.
It was messy. It was a very, very messy board. And Nicole is one of those people. She writes only with a pencil. So she literally, she's the person who, if she's taking notes, it was just us throwing out our ideas, and really thinking about what can we do that will bring together community partners, researchers, and all to really make the biggest make the biggest impacts for our local community.
Yeah, I love that. And what the word that kept coming to mind was social entrepreneurship. And I think when we think about entrepreneurship in the sense of education, I was reminded of an article I read at Hopkins during my doctorate work. And I'm like pretending I'm in comps right now. It was Badalana Leka Boxenbaum 2009. And they talk about this aspect of institutional entrepreneurship. And I think some of the things that people may underestimate in terms of entrepreneurship is that, you can disrupt the status quo, but where you have to have that sustainability and that buy-in at the time and how you're setting up that culture so that the entrepreneurship and the changes that you are making last. And I say that because when you were in that boardroom, you said you talked about the mission statement, you talked about values. Maybe at that time you talked about the tenets of connect, champion, collaborate.
Yes.
How did you ensure that those tenets that you came up with were shared around the culture? How did you build that culture so that everyone around you could then also see themselves in the work and buy into the work that you two were creating?
Well, the first thing we did was we went on a listening tour. The entire first year of the village's existence had nothing to do with research. It was literally cold emails. Because I did graduate school here, and I also worked as an SLP at a local elementary school, I knew a few people, right? I lived in Tallahassee for 6 years. So I knew a good amount of people through the district, but not enough. And she didn't know anybody, right? So we were literally kind of cold emailing principals. And we started visiting the ones who responded, literally saying, hi, we're Nicole and Lakeisha, right? And we went on a listening tour. We went to breakfasts and lunches and always started with, tell us how we can help you, right? So tell us the things, the issues, the concerns, the needs of your schools. And doing it from a way that understanding that, every school will see their, even though as from a researcher's perspective, sometimes we can kind of lump all these things together, but for this individual administrator, this community advocate, this grassroots leader, and we met with we didn't just meet with schools, we met with community advocates, other organizations, our local library, PBS, we met with everybody. And Nicole was, she is very much, her style of leadership is very much we focused. So how can we help you do this thing? Which has been something that's just been an amazing model for me in a lot of the work that I've done. So we did a listening tour where all we did was talk to people, introduce ourselves, and find out what we could do to help meet their needs the most. And so then that's how we came up with those 3 tenets, which is really connect, champion, and collaborate, as you mentioned. And so the connecting is really us serving as a thought partner, right? Us being able to provide information around evidence-based practices where if you have a question about something related to this curriculum you're using, this strategy, how do I know if so-and-so we should get this thing? I'm looking for this book. We can answer those questions. We can point you in the right direction. We can find the research. We can let you know those things, right? We're just going to connect you. And if we don't know the answer, it's a whole university. Somebody knows, right? And then the champion also being very well cognizant that we can't do it all and that there are already people working in this community doing amazing things. There are administrators, there are family members. They are the experts in their communities. I'm an outsider, right? I haven't been here in 6 years. I am an outsider. And while, of course, a lot of the work that we've done has been in Title I schools with a majority African-American student population, Black and Brown students, I'm still an outsider, right? And so building the capacity for those relationships to involve trust means I'm going to champion what you do. I've judged spelling bees, Tropicana speech contests. I've gone to parent literacy night. I've gone to block parties, right? We've done some amazing work that really centers around the ideas that partners have established. We don't need to come in and run the show because first of all, we don't have the capacity for that, nor is it our place, right? But what we can do is provide this feedback, provide this one thing. We have some students from our team. We have some really amazing doc students, and they have been so excited to learn more about these research practice partnerships. And a part of that is building the relationship. And so one of our community partners, we did a block party last year for Halloween, and we made a literacy corner for the block party, right? It was music, DJs, food, and it was a legit block party. And here we are with a story time corner, and they loved it. Like the community, it was amazing, right? Because we've now established the presence of when you call us, like somebody's going to show up. Like we said earlier, our style is very much how do we show up? How do we show that we also value the things that are important to you? Right.
Yeah.
And so the last C is collaborate. We have to remember that we're a research center. And so when you've done the first 2 C's really well, connect and champion, it's a lot easier to collaborate on research. People are a lot more willing and they seek us out for the research opportunities. And so I don't know if this curriculum that we've been using in kindergarten is adequately preparing our kids later down the road, right? So when we will create and design a study that looks at, is this one working well? Is this one really helping get them where they need to be around readiness? What's the evidence behind this one, right? Because we've had some curricula that's being used in South that's been maybe created by some local people, and you know how that happens with educators. Stuff tends to stick around, right?
Yeah.
It may not be any strong evidence around it, but it sticks because it's worked for a few.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's worked for many, but it's important to be able to collaborate on a lot of these projects that allow us to also keep the research moving. And when we've done the first two, it makes our job so much easier as researchers. And also they're willing when then we have ideas, like let's say I am passionate, as you know, about diverse children's books, right? Super passionate. So they come to us and say, hey, we heard y'all are doing so-and-so at the library. Why aren't y'all doing that at our school? Right? Because I've been doing this, I've been doing some trainings with our youth services librarians around increasing language and literacy strategies during story time. And they're like, we need this at our school. Like, what are you doing? Why are you doing it out there? Come here and do it, right? That's the part of when you've established these kinds of connections, they then look for other opportunities and kind of, it's not our core tenet, one of our C's, but it's really one of the things. Tiffany Hogan brought it up in a podcast. I know y'all are familiar with Tiffany. She brought it up when I was doing a podcast with her on her show, Commitment. She was like, it really sounds like y'all need a fourth C. Because the fourth one is commitment, right? It is literally, this is an authentic partnership. It is mutually beneficial and it goes both ways. You have a seat at the table. You help make decisions. You help to drive the show. It is not just Lakeisha come in and say, this is what we're doing for this project. You have an actual role and we need you to play your role, right? And then also know that we're committed to you. We're not going to not show up when you ask us to be there.
Yeah.
Right.
There's so much here that so forgive me. I'm gonna go a little off script here, Danielle. So just forgive me because there's
go for it
here that I think are so important and like just near and dear to my heart. Like coming out of undergraduate, I wanted to be a researcher. I love base science. I love contributing. My goal was and I worked for the FDA for a couple of years doing crack cocaine addiction research. Yeah. And I realized I actually want to be around people more than I want to be in a lab.
Right.
So, my sort of shift to the more applied side of things. So while I love research, I love reading research, and I love, when we contribute on the base side of science to advancing and understanding. But I think so often, I so appreciate that you brought this idea of research harm, like popping into these places where we do some research to advance our sort of piece here, but we actually don't think about the kids and the systems that we're coming into in a way that sort of shows a lot of respect and a lot of support for them. So I so appreciate that. That's a big piece of this.
And I've been on both sides, Jamie. I was a student. I was the grad student who had to go and collect all that data.
Yeah.
I knew that I was never going back to that school again. I wasn't going to do no PD. We weren't going to follow up with reports and say, hey, here's some changes you can make that could really have an impact. Here's some material. We weren't doing any of that stuff, right? And that's it's not necessarily a fault to the researchers who work in that way, because we need that science. We need that because it does, as you mentioned, advance. Yeah. But I just knew that wasn't what I wanted to contribute to.
Yeah. And I think schools and communities are such they're such complex, sort of spaces here. And when we think about some of the applied side of the research, like what research are we putting into the world? And sometimes this is harder research to fund, right? So I think there's some conversation we need to have at like that funding level to kind of push more dollars towards some of these more applied pieces that help us not only think through the strategy that's being applied in the classroom, the ecosystem that thing exists in, but how do we then support that system from a longer term perspective in this process?
And even on the higher education side, right? That's also not the research that's valued in terms of tenure.
Yeah.
And what's looked at and viewed as rigorous. Yeah. Right. So there is work on all sides.
Completely agree. And I remember I was up at Harvard with Bob Brooks, who I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. Sweet, like it's like you jokingly call him Uncle Bob, right? Because he's like this sweet guy. But he asks a question a lot of times when we're doing this work. And I love the question. And is what are we going to do and say when we're in front of that child on Monday? Like, what
Mhm.
about this is going to give us the insight to actually make this child's experience better when we're in front of them? I think it's what
Right.
teachers want. I think it's what parents want. I think it's what
Right.
educators at writ large want so often. And so I think the more we can kind of do to kind of help get that sort of space there, I think the better off we are. I also love your focus on this idea of gaining trust, this listening tour.
Mhm.
Having done some outreach work, I think so often people want, and I had a real good conversation with at the time the CEO of the Boys and Girls Club in Columbus. We started some work there when I was living in Columbus to help partner with that organization. And I went to her and asked the question, like, what do you need? Like, help me understand where your pain points are. What keeps you up at night? What's kind of driving some of the challenges for you? And
And it
she,
throws them off when you ask,
yeah,
doesn't it?
totally
They're
did.
used to it.
Yeah.
They
She's
are
like,
used to it.
stopped her in her tracks. She was like, no one asks that question. And she said, people want to dump something on my lap. I've got this thing to give you. Let me help you with this thing that I've gotten here. Let me just put it on your doorstep. It's like, I need more people to ask me that question. Because I think when you ask the question, you don't always get the answer you thought you were going to get.
Right.
Because I
Right.
think it's from our perspective, we see one
Mhm.
thing from the outside, but on the internal side of this, maybe an entirely different set of challenges that are on the table that are
Mhm.
really top of
Absolutely.
mind that need to be addressed in order to kind of get at the root cause of whatever is happening.
Absolutely.
So I
I mean,
so
when you go
appreciate.
into places, especially in the schools that we particularly are strategic about partnering with, many times the
Yeah,
building is on fire, right? Like there are
yeah,
so many issues.
yeah,
Academics is just one, reading is just one, right?
yeah,
Mhm.
We got to get them here. We
yeah,
got to make sure that they're attending. We got to make sure they're fed, right? What if they get
yeah,
there? We've had schools start to create community and parent resource rooms that are there with one of our schools. They have like a laundry service, a
yeah,
laundromat and everything in the school. So then in their parent resource room, which we then stocked with materials
yeah,
for when you
So
come, then you
cool.
got some stuff to do with your kid while you're waiting.
yeah,
But it's
Mhm.
one of those things. It's where it is not just the minutes of the 90-minute reading block that we're concerned about, right?
yeah,
It is definitely all of the things happening in this stratosphere, that's kind of surrounding the child. And when you have those those ways of thinking,
hmm,
it allows you to be it just changes your perspective. It
yeah,
changes the viewpoint in which you take when you actually walk into those schools, right? And
yeah,
when they do start to answer about what are some of my pressure points or what keeps me up at night, you got to be willing to say, okay, I don't know if I can do anything about that.
yeah,
Mhm.
Or when they say, hey, we're having this issue around kids being okay, well, if y'all do this, here's what we can do to support that parent
yeah,
room, right?
Yeah.
How can we then tie in to what meets that need? Because clearly I can't do, I mean, I can maybe try to connect you to some, some people who may be willing to donate some, but that's not my area, right?
yeah,
Right.
But what we can think about is how, now that you have these families here, what can you be doing to make an even bigger impact while they're here in your building on campus with their kids, right?
yeah.
Mhm.
And when I think about education as a field and what we as educators sometimes are being asked to do in these spaces, right? The work that you're just highlighting here is how fundamentally important it is for us to see the educational institutions in a community as foundational for supporting
Yeah.
the health and success of that community.
Yep.
This no
Absolutely.
longer are the days where I think kids come in, they sit down, and we're going to teach them how to read, how to spell, how to do math, how to write, how to be better scientists, sociology,
Right.
whatever it is we're doing. But there are so many more layers to how do we support family systems? How do we make sure we
Mhm.
make these things more accessible? How do we make sure the kids and families feel safe in our presence?
Right.
All those things that I think go to the laundromat sort of in the school. I'm just like, why doesn't every school think about like ask
Mhm.
those questions? Because I think there's so many spaces where, that even the idea of putting that into effect, you have to ask a pretty fascinating question,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Like, and not being
Right.
afraid to say like, wow, like what's the role of the school? And if you
Mhm.
put like cleaning your clothes totally outside that circle,
Right.
you know,
You
or
don't
are
get
you
there.
you don't
Yeah.
get
You
there,
don't get
right?
there.
So, or do you see yourself as somebody as a school system that's trying to kind of support the health and well-being of families? Literacy is part of this, making sure they have access to some of these services, and then utilizing the space in a very creative way to really
Mhm.
bring some people closer to the school in that. So just can't begin to applaud you enough for that conversation. So,
and not even that 2-gen approach, right? Like,
yeah,
what are you then doing? Because it may also be, how are we ensuring that families are getting what they need? Because
yeah,
sometimes
yeah,
it's literally also, how can we connect the family members
yeah,
with the right other partners and other organizations? So
yeah.
absolutely.
Because it's, this work is bigger than me. This work is bigger than you. This work is bigger than all of us. And I so appreciate that you pointed out the N of 2. Sometimes there's some magic alchemy happening when you get a really positive sort of connection with somebody
Right.
that can really have this multiplying, amplifying effect. And I just so appreciate the two of you have been sort of pushing on this in such an important way for your communities down there. So thank you.
Can I ask a question though about communities and families? I love what you two are bringing out about asking the right questions. And the thing I keep coming back to is, how do you build that trust, right? So often, sometimes our families come, like, and I think of our families have been in school systems where their children were told they couldn't read or they couldn't do it, or so many other countless experiences for families beyond reading that they just didn't feel like they had the support. So Lakeisha, what is it about, like, how do you approach families or even community partners to build that trust first? So some of our readers on video may see that our lights have changed a little bit because of some, home recording, but we are good to go. Lakeisha and Jamie, you were talking about bringing in communities, bringing in families, addressing the needs of families. And Jamie and Lakeisha, I love how you both talked about asking the right questions. And I'm wondering, how do you even get to those questions? And what I mean by that is, how are you even bringing the trust to families and communities when you're talking to them, and specifically families, in order to get the answers that they feel vulnerable enough to share about their experience?
I think for a large part, it helps that I am a part of the community in which I serve, right? And so for a lot of the families, for a lot of the people, there is initially a comfort simply because I am coming as another young Black woman who also has a child who's school age, who may be dealing with a lot of perhaps maybe similar kinds of issues, right? Or at least there's some shared background around something. So that does not hurt, right? But then I think the other part is being honest enough to ask the question in a way without making parents feel as if they aren't the experts on their children, right? Or teachers or admin, right? That they aren't the experts of whatever arena that they're serving. And I think a part of that is not coming in with this savior complex that we've got this thing that's going to work. We're very honest and like, hey, this is what the evidence says. We're going to do our best. We're going to do the things, and this should be what happens and can shift, right? But we know that there's no magic pill, right? There's no thing that's going to come in here overnight. But here's what we can do and how we can do this in a way that's going to move us closer to where we want to be. So I think it's honesty, it's transparency, it's showing up in a way that's respectful, right? That's culturally sensitive, that does not make parents and families feel as if they've wronged their children by what they don't, all these things, right? Or even teachers don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know what they don't know. And that could be due to pre-service training or and we know now teachers come into classroom settings in so many different paths, right? So they could have not even gone to school to be a teacher, right?
Yeah.
So, but approaching people, I often say just as a kind human, right? Like, first, let's just be good people to start, right? And not feeling like they have to do this thing for me. I think oftentimes, sometimes as researchers, we have this air of, but I have this thing that can help them. I don't know why they just won't let me do it. This is this thing that's going to be great for them. And that's not necessarily the approach that's most valued, right? Especially in vulnerable populations and especially in communities where there has been research harms that have taken place, where they've seen these names. And when you have an organization and a center that's as big as FCRR, it's 20, 30 different people who could have been at that school, right?
Yeah.
So it's important that and what we do and how we show up reflects everybody there. So that's been another part of the work, is around ensuring that once we go in and build these relationships, if other people from our teams also go in, hey, this is what's been established here, and we've been doing some amazing work around. Even a lot of our other colleagues are thinking about, even as they write new grants, what are we adding in around community engagement? What are the ways in which the village can support this project, or the people who are on, project coordinators are thinking about students a part of the research assistants roles. They're volunteering at these schools. We're doing these things. It's helping people be more purposeful and intentional when we because you still got to do your research. We get that.
Right.
Yeah.
You still have to do it. But if you're doing a research project at a school and they reach out to me and say, hey, it would be so cool if we had somebody from FCRR who would do this Black History Month read-in, right? Like, we're just doing books. I don't need to come. You go. You're the one that's collecting data at this school, right? It's important for you to have a presence there, right? So I think because of our way of doing things, I can't say we changed it all, because clearly that it's just been a few years, but I think people are more cognizant. People are more familiar of our way of work, and people are willing. And I think that's all Nicole and I really wanted, because it can't just be the two of us. We do now have a team. It's like 7 of us now, and we've got some amazing doctoral students on some training grants that are being prepared to then be this next set of researchers who will be doing this work. But I think it's even more important to us that even all around us are seeing this model for how you can do this. And that's some of our current projects. We're doing something very similar with the connection we now have with our local school district. This is the first time in FCRR's 20th years as a center having an actual data sharing agreement with our local school district.
Outstanding.
And so we're modeling how to do the same thing at our local HBCU, FAMU, and their research laboratory school. How do you have this model of support coming from the college system that actually makes a huge difference and role and impact in what's happening in these schools and communities around them? So
thank you. And there's a little bit of a bit here that you touched on. I want to kind of highlight for just a moment here, is that you coming in from the Florida Regional Research Center, you have a lot of experts down there, right?
Right.
And I think the way you're sort of positioning it is less about being the expert and more about having expertise. And I think maybe it's semantic, and I will accept that it could be.
No, it makes a difference.
But I think it's a really important distinction for me, because expert leaves very little room for humility, leaves very little space for others in the conversation. Versus, I think expertise can be shared in a way that brings a lot of humility, a lot of respect for the other person sitting across the table, and a lot of compassion for the entire system that we're both existing in this moment, right? And so when we talk, with our external partners in this work, or even internally, that I'm trying to kind of actively shift how we talk about this work, and how I want to bring expertise to the table. But I also want to make sure I leave room to grow and leave room to learn, and leave room for everybody else around me to kind of also share in that expertise. So thank you so much for sharing that.
That's such a great point. I mean, because we can't be looked at, and very often you're called to the table as the expert, but it's no, I have not practiced in therapy in anybody's school for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Things have changed.
Yeah.
And that's important for me to be aware of and know that, no, you're the expert at this school, right? And very often what we find as we do a lot of our work with these, trainings and professional development, a large part of it is building capacity. So a large part of our research practice partnership work with our respective stakeholders is, how do we build the capacity for you to believe that you can go now do this with your people? You don't need me to come in, because it can't always. At first, it was like they only wanted Nicole. Right? Then they only want me. And we're slowly shifting this narrative. You won't always get one of us.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you may not always get one of our team members, but you now have the capacity to be able to do this work. And we want to equip them with that as well.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about how empowering it is to show up to a school and sort of really let them know they are the experts and they have expertise in their space. And even from a parenting standpoint, sitting across from a parent to say, you know your child better than I ever will. So you are the expert in your child. So bring that expertise to us. I'll bring my expertise on the reading, language development, systems impact, and ecological thinking on that. And we're going to come together to do something really good for your community. And that's where I think the magic, if there's magic here, right? And I hate to, sometimes we talk about all these things. It's good research, right? It's good practice, but it's sometimes it can feel a little bit like magic.
It is.
So, which I love. I love that interesting sort of mystical intersection there. So,
yeah. I think we could talk, like, speaking of magic, I think we could talk about this for like hours and hours on end. And Lakeisha, I mean, we would love to sit down with you in person at some point. But respectful of our time, I think we now have to get into some not rapid fire, but some leadership reflection questions about where you are now and how you're reflecting on your leadership. And so you talked a lot about mentorship and Nicole being a mentor for you. Has there been anyone else in your journey who's been a mentor, and what have been those values of mentor that you have found so valuable as you've grown as a leader?
Definitely Nicole, but also every person that I've worked with. I have been very fortunate to have all of my mentors be other Black women in this field. And I know that that is not something that I can take for granted, because there are so few of us, especially in communication disorders, right? In a field that is 93% white. I know that I am very fortunate. I know only 3% African Americans within our field, and even fewer that have PhDs. Yeah. So I have been extremely blessed to have Dr. Regina Lemon, who showed me the field, Dr. Sharita Thomas Tate, who I worked with and did my PhD with, Dr. Julie Washington, who I did my postdoc with, and then Dr. PT, who has been just this mentor that has been through so many different stages. That first, from graduation up until, now we're like colleagues, right? and partners in this work. And so what I've learned from each of them, which took a little bit for me to be comfortable with, but was really how I started off, Jamie, when we talked about dialect and code switching, but was to always show up as my authentic self and to not water down the work that we do. For a very long time, I would say when I was introducing myself that I'm Lakeisha Johnson, I have expertise in culturally and linguistically diverse populations. That's not true, right? My expertise is in African-American kids, African-American English. I don't need to water down the fact that I have this niche area, because it would be no different than someone who's focused on Spanish speakers, or someone who's focused on whatever population, or, people who have disfluence, whatever it is, right? That's one of the biggest things that I've learned from them, was being as authentic as possible about how I show up in the work that I do, but also bringing people in after me. I now have 3 amazing young Black women who are my doctoral students, and I sit there and think, like, I'm still figuring out my life, and here I have 3 students. But I think it's been in a handful of master's students and undergraduates, but it has been an amazing opportunity to be able to provide the same gems that they've kind of given me to my own students, and to see them kind of walk these same kinds of paths. And then I think the other thing that I've learned from them, I've also had people, my mentors are pretty dynamic speakers, right? So being able to watch any of the ones I've named, if you've ever seen Julie, Nicole, you've seen them in a presentation, they command a room, right? And
1000%.
That part is, I'm very fortunate to have worked with some of the best in within our fields.
Yeah. And I, knowing a fairly sizable amount of the folks you named personally, you have an all-star slate who've been supported.
I'm lucky.
Yeah,
Well, I'm blessed. I'm fortunate and blessed. I mean, it really, because like I said, it's really so few of us.
Yeah.
It's so very few of us. So,
I'm gonna ask a question that I have some really good friends and colleagues as a head of school. The work can be a little lonely. There's a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, a lot of demands from every single, kind of facet of the world, from parents, student to leaders, to teachers, to and the community at large. And so I have some really good friends and colleagues who remind me sometimes that, Jamie, you have to take care of yourself too.
Definitely.
So, because I think it's something that, this idea of self-care is not one that, especially when you are hard charging, you've got work to do, we've got passions, some needs in the community we need to fill. Sometimes it's hard to take a pause, reflect on that.
What's that? What's work-life balance?
Yeah. That's a great question. That's another hour and a half podcast we could probably, talk about. So what are you doing right now to kind of really kind of put your own oxygen mask on, to take care of yourself and the work, to make sure that you're able to show up and be your best authentic self for everybody?
I am an avid Pelotoner. I enjoy working out.
Me too.
And I am in my second trimester of pregnancy, and it has probably been the most challenging, that I'm not able to do as much as I could.
Yeah.
But I'm still I love cycling and yoga, Pilates. I love it all.
Yeah.
But I have a newfound love for even just outdoors, kind of walking. Even though I'm a country girl, I'm not an outdoorsy country girl. But I think the pandemic really gave me value in just getting out for walks. And so my day does not feel right if I don't at least get a little bit of sunshine, or get a little bit of a walk in outside by myself, because my daughter was here for virtual school for like almost all kindergarten, and my outside walk was my only time alone. So that's been something that I've been doing for the last 3 years, and it's really a way that I can pour into myself. And the other thing is, we have a group chat. We have a group chat that we can just laugh and share jokes and memes. And, I think you need that other side.
You do.
You have to have balance, because that leadership role can be so heavy, and especially in a time to where a lot of what we do is honestly being criticized. And you have to have some space for some levity in life. And so working out, you'll have to give me your Peloton name, Danielle, so we can follow each other.
I will email it to you.
So we can follow each other. And then just having that support group who cares nothing about. They want the kids to learn how to read, but they don't care how we get there, right? They know it's important, but they are focused on, just a good girlfriend group that can really help support.
Yeah. Good friends, great activity. And I love that you like to ride. I'm a cyclist. I ride spend my time outside on a bike. So I have a lot of love for Peloton. I'm more of a Zwift guy, It's
yes.
But
I
think
we all got bikes during the pandemic. Of course, my daughter was learning how to ride. She learned how to ride a bike. She was maybe 3 or 4. She was 4 at the beginning of the pandemic. So we all had to get bikes, and that was really when we then got to Peloton, because it was like, okay, we want to keep doing this all year round. And I mean, Tallahassee, the weather is relatively mild, but you got to deal with the pollen and all the the other parts of being outside all the time when it gets super hot here. So
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Well, I can't wait till we have a group ride together or something like that.
Yeah. Post baby.
Yes.
I'm done on the bike.
Yeah. When you're ready, just let me know. I'll share and Jamie, I have a family account on Peloton. I can create something like, I don't know, Jamie HOS. Jamie head of school. I'll think of something.
I probably should give Peloton a try. I need to open it up a little bit. So.
Absolutely. I am struggling to pick our last question today, because there's so many other questions I'd love to get down. We talked about Maya's book nook a little bit. I think it was integrated in this conversation, but I think we more explicitly talked about it last time. And, to me, in talking about all of the things that we talked about, from community engagement to partnerships to equity approaches to integrating the ecological framework again, I also wanted to ask you about your curiosity and your learning as a leader. And so, Jamie, I'm going to because I am struggling to ask the last question, I want to give you the opportunity to ask any of the last leadership questions for Lakeisha.
So I'm gonna sort of pick up on what you were sort of putting down right there, this idea of learning and reflection. I've been reading. Danielle and I are big. I don't think this is a secret. We're very, very big Brene Brown fans. Like we love her work. I've been reading a ton of her books. I've been reading Atlas of the Heart. The idea of kind of trying to figure out how to organize and name our feelings. I read Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett not too long ago. So this idea of like, I think during the pandemic, we've all been sort of experiencing so much. And we don't have the best vocabulary when it comes to our emotions and our feelings. And so I think both those books for me were just really at the right time and the sort of the right content. So that's what I've been sort of thinking about. And as I lead, like how am I sort of being aware of my own emotions in the process? How am I thinking and reflecting and sort of naming them, kind of putting them on the surface and kind of honoring them in a lot of ways? So as a leader and as a researcher, what are you sort of really thinking about or reflecting on or reading about right now in your leadership space?
What I'm reflecting on in terms of the leadership space is right now, top of mind is I'm going to be out for a period of time. I'm fortunate that baby comes over the summer, so I'm going to essentially get half the summer and the fall semester off, which means I'm going to be gone for quite some time, which is nice for us. But, as a leader, it does make you feel like we have to make sure all these things are aligned. So I've been thinking a lot about how do I elevate the people on our team, right? Everybody has their unique strengths. And figuring out how they can use this opportunity as moments to walk in those spaces, where they really have these strengths and being able to dig into them over the next few months so they feel well equipped for that part. Because a lot of them are like, what are we going to do? They only want you guys. Like, no, we're preparing for this, right? Yeah. In terms of reading and how I keep growing as a leader, I love NERP, the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships. I think it's important to see how others are doing this work, to see the models that they have. What I've been reading right now, I've been reading pretty much only children's books. The last book that I read is Michelle Obama's The Light We Carry towards the end of the year, which was a phenomenal read, of course. But a lot of my reading right now is focused over on Maya's Book Nook. We're doing the ABCs of Black History. So I have been, Maya has helped me select these change makers, leaders, and icons that we've been doing, and then finding children's books written by Black authors about these people, which could be a whole nother podcast about how challenging that can be.
Right.
So I've been reading a lot of children's books lately, but I do love Brene Brown, so I do need to check out her most recent book. She has some good stuff. And one, you talked about the naming of feelings and all. Morgan Harper Nichols, she is a poet and an illustrator. I found her on Instagram, and she just released the book that came out on Valentine's Day, so just a few days ago. And I cannot think of the name of it, but I'll have to look it up so you can add it in the notes. But her thoughts around how we are showing up in spaces, but also how we are thinking about how we go into each month. She has these keys, kind of questions you can reflect on and ask yourself at the beginning of each month. And they've now all been compiled into these poems in an amazing book. And it's been really, really fascinating because she's also a Black woman who has autism and I think maybe ADHD. She talks a lot about her story, but how she uses poetry and all to really allow her to show up as her best self, but to also give others the strategies that they need in their toolbox to then show up as their best selves in whatever spaces, professional spaces, personal spaces. So that's kind of been what I've been reading lately.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to name a feeling I'm feeling right now. And that feeling is awe. Because I don't think we talk about this feeling enough, right? When you run into somebody who's doing such incredible work, who is living and really kind of leaning in to their points of passion, talking about the way you connect with people, the way you're serving your community, and the purpose behind this. I'm just left here today with nothing but an incredible sense of awe. So thank you for sharing your story, everything that you've shared today in terms of the work that you and Nicole are doing. I would love to at some point to come down and check and see some of these spaces. Maybe we can kind of schedule a visit, have you up here to New York.
Definitely.
Show you some.
It's been a mild winter. I would say you need to get away, but it's been mild.
Yeah. It's felt like, we're like Northern Georgia right now. Like it's, not warm, not cold at all.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for having me. I mean, I appreciate your kind words. It has not been easy getting to this space of being able to merge all of the things. And a lot of people often ask, like, how do you do this stuff to where you are doing this work that you're really passionate about, but also being able to meet the requirements of what we need to do, on the university level. And it's challenging. It is a struggle that I deal with. I don't spend nearly as much time writing as I should because, Jamie, as a leader, you spend so much time in meetings and showing up. Right? Part of what we do is show up. And so, I don't have it all together, but I think that being surrounded by a strong team allows us to continue to push forth and do the work. And I've been intentional around trying to merge these passions together so that I'm able to do the work in a way that still feels true to what I feel is my purpose.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's no better way to close this episode. I know that this just has some thought and reflection for future. And so I do hope, and I know that we will all be speaking again. That was our second episode of Lead on Read. Jamie, thank you so much for your hosting, your co-hosting presence. And Lakeisha, thank you for just showing up with us today and offering so much that we can continue to hold on to over the next several months.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you both and your time.
Thank you. And thank you all, our leaders on readers. I tried calling them leaders on readers last time and it didn't work and it's still not working. So thank you, readers, for listening to this episode of the Lead on Read podcast. As always, you can check out all of our bookmarks at readpodcast.org, or you could find the Read Podcast through the windwardschool.org/WI. Feel free to follow along with the WI and all of our social media platforms. And if you have any thoughts or questions or ideas of next topics and speakers like Dr. Lakeisha Johnson, you can always email me at info@readpodcast.org. We will also have all of the links to find out more about Lakeisha on our website as well. And that's it. I just feel so humble. I just feel so great. Oh, I love this. I think that's it. So our last official sign off. Lakeisha, you did such a great job last time. Would you like to do that until next time, readers, again?
Until next time, readers.
Yep.
Thank you.